Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you could make it. I'm John Cleveland, host, and today I'll be talking about taking us through a little journey back in time, talking about stars and their inspiration for spirituality and religion. This talk is going to, our journey, is going to have a structure, you can almost think of it like a V. I'm going to start out talking about the awareness of the stars in the ancient world, and then move to the importance and significance of the stars in ancient spirituality, ancient religion, and talk about a physical description of stars as far as the knowledge of our ancient ancestors go. And then transition right over to how we understand the stars, how much we've learned since then, and what significance we might place in the stars, and finally finish up with our awareness of the stars in the world we have today. Starting with the awareness of what it was like in the ancient world to look at the stars, to know about the stars, to think about the stars. In the ancient world, it was very different from today because, of course, they didn't have electricity. So let's think about that. If you would like, I invite you to close your eyes for just a minute. Go back to a time without electricity, without artificial lighting. Now, when the sun starts to set, you know it's time to move. It's time to make sure you're ready for the darkness, because when it gets dark, it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of things done. You need to have things in place, you need to know where they are, and you can have an oil lamp or some other kind of small light source, but nothing compared to the daylight. And when it gets dark, you see the night sky. Unless it's cloudy, the night sky you see is dark, with thousands of stars, with the faint band of the Milky Way arching across the sky, and other things that might come and go, planets and the moon. It changes every night. You know a lot of these stars, you're familiar with their constellations, you know where they're going to come up, you know when they're going to go down, you know what time of year it is from looking at this, because you see it every night. Night after night, you're familiar with the night sky. And the night sky that you see is so much more awesome than what we see today. So think about that for a minute. Go ahead and open your eyes. And think about how different that is. How different compared to what we have today. Electric lighting is great. It allows us to get a lot of stuff done. But between the electric lighting in our house, we go into the house, we have all the lights we need, and we don't spend time seeing the night sky, and the fact that electric light pollution has made it so that you can't really see many stars in most places. Nothing like our ancient ancestors used to see. When I was in Chicago, I think I could see 5, and I think they're mostly planets. And now, and back then, our ancient ancestors, they knew the planets were different because they didn't stay in the same constellations. But they didn't know that they were, for instance, a lot smaller. They didn't know that they were a lot closer. All they knew is that these stars that they could see were different because they moved. And we know the ancient people saw these stars as significant. We know because they put a lot of effort into a lot of this stuff. They put a lot of effort into noticing and including these stars in their artwork, in their stories, in their lives. For instance, here's some pictographs on some rocks where a person climbed up to where this ledge is and drew this little picture here, including either a very bright star, perhaps a supernova we think could be, and put this up there so that it would be there as a reminder, maybe, as an offering, we're not sure, but it takes a lot of effort to do this kind of thing. And when you're just struggling to survive, every little bit of effort counts for a lot. They clearly thought this was important. And we can see this in culture across the globe. If we look at Stonehenge, this is what Stonehenge looked like before the Romans damaged it. It was a nice, symmetrical, perfect structure that marked a lot of alignments with stars, where stars would rise, where stars would set, with things like the positions of the sun at the solstices or equinoxes, and we see monuments like this across the globe. We see them on every continent except for one. Anybody want to guess what continent we don't see them on? Antarctica, right, there's a good reason. Any place where there were humans, they made these, and they made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. It's included in Greek culture. A lot of us know the legends of Perseus. I'll tell you the story very quickly, in an abbreviated form. But the queen boasted that her daughters were more beautiful even than the daughters of Poseidon. And that wasn't a very good thing to do, because it made Poseidon mad. And due to the repercussions of that statement, the only way that they were able to resolve it was for her to sacrifice her daughter to the sea monster, the Kraken. And for those of you who have seen Clash of the Titans, you know the rest of the story. Perseus comes to save her and destroy the Kraken using the head of Medusa. There's a lot of other details to that story, and I wish we could go through them all, because one really neat thing about these stellar stories is they're so rich with how humans interact, rich with meaning, what you should do and what you shouldn't do, rich with lessons about how you should live your life. I've got another one that we don't know the whole story, but we do know that our ancestors, of everyone here in this room, revered an artifact that was made 3,600 years ago or so, and that was the Nebra sky disk. It was a disk with gold leaf. Obviously, they put a lot of effort and a lot of concern into this sacred object. It was solid bronze, gold leaf depicting the stars, and it served both to scientifically keep track of the heavens so that they would know when to add a leap month. And being that it was found in a stone circle, being that so much effort to make it beautiful went into it, one would think that it probably also is used for rituals. It was found in a stone circle. And here is a full-size replica of it. Of course, I don't have the real one, but this is the Nebra sky disk. It touches me deeply to hold this and feel it, to think that my ancestors, 3,600 years ago, made this, used it, revered it, saw it, and thought, wow, this is part of our connection to the cosmos. So I'll pass that around. If people want to, well, better, I'll just leave it right here. If you want to take a look at it sometime, you can. It's not bronze, so we don't want to drop it, like the real one. So there's a culture in Germany. There are plenty of Native American legends. In this story, this Native American tribe saw the stars as humans. Well, not quite humans, but like people. They were the sky people. And in their stories, these sky people would come down to Earth at times. And the sky person who came down at one point was a woman who married a man, a human man, down on Earth, and they had kids. Well, over time, she decided that she wanted to go back to the sky. So she thought, well, you know, the husband's not going to like this, so I'll make this canoe in secret that'll carry me back up to the sky. And by this point, they also had kids, and she was going to take the kids too. So they got it one day. The husband went out hunting, and it got to be nightfall, and they said, okay, this is the time to move. Let's do it. Let's get in the canoes. They got in the canoes, and they started singing. And by singing, that started to lift the canoes up into the sky. Well, the husband came back, and he rushed over, and he managed to catch and grab the kids' canoe. But the woman escaped up to the sky. The kids were unhappy and wanted to join their mother, so the father said, okay, you guys can join your mother. And then they started singing, and they lifted their canoe up into the sky too. A lot of these legends have moral purposes. A lot of them also explain things that we see. In this case, if you're here in North America at a middle latitude and you're aware of the Big Dipper here, what you see is at certain times of the year, it will be low on the horizon and then lift up into the sky, just like the canoes did. This was an explanation for why the Big Dipper does that and lifts up into the sky, to commemorate, to show how this canoe was lifted up into the sky. And if we look to the Navajo had a legend where they personified the Big Dipper here, And we know this one as Cassiopeia, also associated with the Perseus story, with the Andromeda story. But in this case, of course, they don't know about Perseus and Andromeda. What they know is that they had these two constellations that went around the North Star. They saw that as a reminder, as a representation of a man and a woman raising a household and circling the center fire in the middle of their teepee. The wife responsibly taking care of the things that need to be done at home. The husband is fulfilling the important role of a husband in getting food and things like that. And so these Navajo would be able to look to the sky, look to the stars for a reminder of whatever role they're doing to act responsibly and fulfill their household duties. And of course, shouldn't go without mentioning that we know, our ancient ancestors didn't, but we know that our sun is a star too. So if we're talking about stellar things, at least from a modern perspective, we can recognize that the star that's closest to us is extremely important in so many spiritualities too. If we go maybe to Egypt, where they had a sun god, a lot of places had a sun god. The Greeks certainly did, or with the god Apollo. And the pagan wheel of the year is also based on emotions of the sun. It's hard to get away from the idea of the sun as central to so many different approaches to spirituality. So what does that tell us? These stories, and I again wish I had time to go through more because they're really interesting and there's so many of them, but it wouldn't be hard at all to spend all afternoon or all week or all year telling these stories because there's just so many of them. Not just a book, but many books. These stories, these approaches to spirituality using stars, were important to our ancestors for so long. It's important to realize that the stars were present to our ancestors on a regular basis, night after night. They would see all these stars. They'd see the motions playing out in a lot of their stories. When I was putting this together, I couldn't even come up with a good word for this. Present? Present, okay, they're here. We see them all the time. But it's so much more than that. They were in your face. They were something you couldn't avoid. They were something that you couldn't ignore. And they would come back time and time again as you had a clear night when you would see these stars. Present was a little bit weak here. The stars, to our ancient ancestors, were important. They didn't know exactly how, they didn't know exactly the mechanism, but they felt time and time again that what happened in the sky had a big impact on what happened on the flat earth. If they saw something going wrong up there or something unexpected, they wondered why. If they saw the stars doing certain things in certain constellations, they wondered why. They wondered how it was going to impact trying to get the crops in, surviving a war, or 100 other difficult things, maybe a childbirth or something like that. The stars were recognized as important to their daily lives, important to their very survival. And the stars were meaningful. As we saw with those stories, they incorporated so many different ways to show the meaningfulness of the stars to their lives, the meaningfulness of what was important for them morally, what was important for them spiritually. The stars were a constant source of meaning in the lives of so many of our ancestors for thousands of years. So let's look at those stars. Let's look at how they saw the stars. Now we see the stars a little bit differently because we know some things that they didn't. They saw the stars as small things up there in the dome of the sky. They put together the evidence available to them in a logical way. That logical way, time and time again, we see in human culture across the continents, was a flat earth underneath the dome and the stars inside the dome as little hanging lights or little hanging lamps or little hanging something. They didn't know how they glowed. But they know that they could make a light with a little oil candle. Well, maybe they're oil candles. And maybe they're, not that far. Because we don't naturally think of the kinds of distances that are involved with the stars. So here we have the Egyptian pantheon. We have the god Nut that formed the dome of the sky with the stars there and the flat earth underneath in the Egyptian cosmology of the world. One that's familiar to a lot of us, and the one that's probably easiest to check up on. It's not easy to find Egyptian texts about Nut for most of us in our day-to-day lives. However, a lot of us can easily get a hold of Genesis 1 in most Bibles. In most Bibles, if you read Genesis 1, step by step, you can see it lays out exactly this description, where you have a flat earth, a domed sky with a hard firmament. In fact, the word used, raquia, is the same word as a hard bowl. It literally says a hard bowl was placed to make the earth, and then the stars put on the inside and things like that. With this, the story makes a lot of sense if you read Genesis 1. You say, oh, of course. You start off by dividing the water up here from the water down here. Then you put in the hard bowl. Then you do the other things. And throughout it would take more than a whole nother lecture to go through all the other verses, but there's verses all through the Bible that reinforce this and make it clear that they're not talking about anything else. The Hebrews, however, were a relatively small group. So what other groups do we have? If we take a look at the Hindu area, their cosmology is somewhat similar. I don't want to get into all of it just for the span of time. But again, we have the stars over top of a earth that you could walk around on that's supported somehow in a domed area, because that's what it looks like. And if you talk to the scientists that work on things like the Nebra disk, what they'll say is look at their cosmology. Same type of thing. With the Nebra disk, this is a depiction of the Nebra disk arching across the dome of so here you've got the dome of the sky, the flat earth, the water around it, and they may have included the idea of a boat to carry the sun back from the setting to the rising place. The Egyptians had that too. And that might be what looks like a boat on the Nebra disk. Another thing you can see here is a group of, in this case, 7 stars, the Pleiades. The Pleiades play into a lot of myths and stories and legends in a lot of different religions, and there's a lot of rich and interesting stories there. I would encourage you, if you might remember, the recent Cosmos episode went through several of them. Highly recommended. Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson's excellent Cosmos series goes through a lot of these in ways that show how important, meaningful, and powerful these were to our ancient ancestors. Now, that makes a lot of sense based on the evidence at hand. Wondering what the earth is like? Wondering if it's flat? Go outside and take a look. Go stand in the field and look around. It's obviously flat. Not sure if the sky is a dome or not? Go outside and take a look. There it is. And you can see the stars rise in the east over there, set in the west, going right across the dome. Obviously we're in a dome. You know, not sure that the stars are little? Well, take a look. There they are. They look pretty little. It's obvious that this is the best our ancestors could do with the information at hand. These aren't silly. These aren't wrong conclusions based on the evidence you have. They make perfect sense. They're perfectly logical. Our ancestors were smart. But they didn't have some of the tools. And when we use some of those tools, we find out some other things. So now we've looked at what it was like back then, how aware they were of the stars, what the stars meant, what their physical understanding of the stars were. Now let's look at our physical understanding. Oh, cover one quick thing. A lot of ancient texts make a lot more sense if you understand that. If you're aware of the world they're living in, then all these things that you might read and think, that's a little bit odd, they make perfect sense. The flood story is a great example. And the Old Testament is probably one of the most available ancient texts we have. But I encourage you to find other ones too, because there's plenty of other ones where you can see these types of things playing out. Just one quick example from the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, here we've got Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the Magi, the wise men are going to come to, because they've seen something happening in the stellar area that obviously means something's happening on Earth. Remember the importance of the stars. to people's daily lives. Where do they come from? Well, it says explicitly they come from the east. Well, if they're following a star in the east, then they would have had to come from the west. But it says they came from the east. So that doesn't make sense until you realize that if you've got little stars floating around inside a dome, and you're an all-powerful God, you can move them any place you want. Whereas if instead you're seeing them from many, many millions of miles away, it's not very easy to, move them around without causing all kinds of chaos. So it makes sense that the stars are small, close, and not part of, solar systems, galaxies, and things like that a long ways away. Okay, so if there was a star, if you're trying to think of this in a modern sense, then you're going to think, okay, if there is a star, then it rises in the east. Hold on a second. If it rises in the east, then as soon as it gets dark and you're following the star, you're going to start going east. Okay, you start walking east. You're walking east, you're walking east. As the star's going up, partway through the night, midnight, it's going to get overhead, and you're going to stop. Or maybe it'll be a little south or a little north. You're kind of wandering around. And then it's moving west. Now you're going to the west. You move east for half the night, west for half the night. And then it's daytime, so you stop. Next morning, you get up and you start going back east, and then halfway through you start getting back to west. You're not going to get to Jerusalem. And if the star isn't, depending on where the star is in the sky, you might have a little north or south loopy-loop stuff in there too. What a mess. Okay, you get to Jerusalem. Now we follow the story where you get to Jerusalem, right? And you tell King Herod, because that's an integral part of the story that you have to tell him so that he can do nasty things. And then you're going to continue following the star. How are you going to follow the star to Bethlehem? According to the story, you follow it south now. That doesn't make any sense. You can't follow a star south unless it just pops up, just a minute. And then you couldn't have been following it east in the first place. So you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it makes a lot of sense if you think of these stars as a little light that you can move around. You can move it around. You can have these people, trailing around anywhere you want. And then, in case anyone's wondering, then it becomes even more clear. Why? Because the star comes and rests over a certain house to designate a certain house. Oh my gosh, that can't be a very big star. If you're going to pick out one house, you can't be more than a few hundred feet up, right? If it's 1,000 feet up, you don't know what house it's pointing to. So if it's designating one house, it's got to be just a few hundred feet up above the house. Can you imagine if an actual star was just a few hundred feet above a house? Oh man. You can imagine if an actual star was a few 100,000 miles above their house, there wouldn't be a house left. Certainly not. And even then it wouldn't designate a single house. Again, it's a different worldview when you think of these as little lights attached to a dome overhead. We know that based on the tools of science, this is the kind of situation we actually have. We actually are on something that's not flat, not immobile and fixed, but moving and rotating. And it's that motion that makes it look like the stars are rising and setting. And that a lot of these things here that we thought were just, some weird kind of star that was able to move, are actually extremely small compared to the stars. The ancients didn't understand, our ancient ancestors did not understand how big the stars were. How could they? You're looking up at the sky and you see some lights. You don't have an idea of these astronomical distances and astronomical sizes. Let's think about those astronomical sizes. So let's take a look. At some of those sizes. A lot of us are familiar with them already, and you saw from the picture I just showed that they're pretty big. Well, how big are they? Okay, our local star. Our closest star is a lot bigger than this is the Earth down here. Just this little speck. And our local star is by no means an unusually large star. In fact, there's a lot of stars that are bigger. So if we took a look at our local star compared to Sirius that you can see in the wintertime, and Arcturus, which you can see a lot of nights, you can see it's dwarfed by a lot of other stars. And the Earth you can't see at all. And even so, with those, there's even larger stars than that out there. If we take a look here, now keep your eye on Sirius. This is Sirius down here. The sun is 1 pixel at this scale. So some stars are just huge. And our sun will get a lot bigger, not that size, but it'll get a lot bigger too when it gets to the red giant stage. These stars were huge
What's with
Our
the
huge.
edge?
All right, we know a little bit about size. We know a little bit about distance, because just from that size scale, you can get a feel for how far away they have to be. I'll come back to that in a minute. We start off with what a star is. It's a cloud of hydrogen gas. If you have a cloud of hydrogen gas and it's big enough, then gravity starts to pull it together. And if you're familiar with how gravity works, the closer together the things are that are being attracted to each other, the stronger they're going to be pulled. So it's kind of like a runaway situation, where once you start coming together, you're pulled together really strongly. Okay, so we get a bunch of hydrogen gas together, we pull it together really strongly. What's going to stop it from just crunching down? Now we can feel our weight here, right? This is from the mass of the Earth and our own bodies, and you saw how small that is. Gravity is going to scale with size. It's a little more complicated than that, but in general, bigger thing, more gravity. That's why people can jump really high on the moon. So this much mass has got enormous gravity. It's really going to crush this stuff together a lot more than we can feel our own weight. What's going to stop that? How can you possibly stop that collapse? Well, it so happens that when you start crushing this hydrogen together, hydrogen, some helium, you can enable nuclear reactions that allow the hydrogen to combine into helium, and that liberates huge amounts of energy, because you lose a little bit of mass that gets converted into energy. So the helium you end up with is actually a little bit lighter than the hydrogen you started with. So we've got gravity crushing in, and then we've got fusion pushing out. Hold on a second though. If that's going to push out and stop this collapse, it's got to be an awful lot of energy, an awful lot of force. This gravity is unbelievably powerful. We just talked about that mass. What could possibly stop that? A nuclear reaction. A nuclear reaction. A lot of people are familiar with this equation. This, E equals mc squared, is the engine that lights up the stars. It's the engine that stops the collapse in its tracks and holds the star together, holds it up. It's easy to forget how powerful this equation is. If you look at it, it's energy times equals mass times the speed of light, c, squared. The speed of light's a huge number. It's really fast. If you square a huge number, you get an enormous number. That means a tiny amount of mass gives you an incredible amount of energy. Now one time, I was hiking. I was hiking along, and after I went a little ways, I thought, did I just feel something in my shoe? Nah, there's nothing there. Kept hiking. After another mile, it happened to roll right underneath my foot, and I felt it, and I thought, I've got a little tiny pebble in my shoe. And I thought, no, that's really small, and before I could even do anything, it slipped out of my foot again, someplace else in there. So I just kept hiking. After a while, it did it again, and I thought, all right, I gotta stop and get this thing out. So I stopped, and I picked up this tiny little pebble out of my shoe and tossed it aside. Tiny little pebble. If you sit down and do some calculations with this, what you find is that a tiny amount of matter can give you a huge amount of energy. I'll use my little pebble as an example. That little pebble, if I had converted that mass into energy, is enough energy to lift our biggest aircraft carrier, the Nimitz class aircraft carrier, at 100,000 metric tons, to lift it higher than a commercial jet flies in the sky from that pebble. That's how much energy we get when we convert mass into energy. And what's amazing is our local star, which you just saw, isn't really that big compared to some of them. Our local star is converting matter into energy at an incredible rate. It's converting 40 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers of weight into energy every second. 40 aircraft carriers, 40 aircraft carriers, 40 aircraft carriers. That's solar power. That holds up the gravity as long as you have fuel. But hold on a second. If you've got a contest, a battle, between one side that uses fuel and one side that doesn't, who's going to win? It's kind of like a war of attrition where one side loses resources and the other side magically doesn't. Gravity doesn't need any fuel. Sooner or later, this is going to start to run out of fuel. And as it does, the gravity's going to crunch it in farther, and that extra pressure will enable more nuclear reactions. Because of that, the larger a star is, the stronger the gravity is. The stronger the gravity is, the faster it has to go through fuel to stop the gravity. And that means that it's not going to live as long. So unlike animals, we're used to bigger things living longer and the little fly living 2 weeks, it's the other way around for stars. With stars, the bigger they are, the faster they die, and the harder they fall. We've developed the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, which will allow us, using measurements made on a star, to figure out where it is in its life. Figure out how big it is, figure out so many different aspects of it, and we can tell all this without actually going there and looking at it. We can tell this from millions and millions and millions of miles away. This is what happens over time. You start to get new reactions where you're combining helium atoms to make carbon, where you're combining other pieces of these nuclear fragments, the atoms together, to make higher and higher elements. And as you're doing that, you're liberating energy, propping the star up and keeping it from collapsing. But you're still using fuel, and you can only do this for so long. When you can't do it any longer, the whole star collapses really amazingly quickly. And that enables more nuclear reactions, and the sum of those together gives us a supernova. A supernova explosion gives us all the elements over iron. The ones under iron are made through fusion and other processes, the fusion that we just talked about combining things like that. And of course, you've got hydrogen and helium from the Big Bang, mostly hydrogen. That gives us our whole periodic table. Just as a brief summary, an overview of this, which is, here's a nice supernova. A supernova allows a single star to give off more light for just a few weeks than an entire galaxy. A single star can outshine a whole galaxy when a supernova explosion happens. And it scatters the guts of that star out into interstellar space. The guts including all those elements we just saw, and allows the formation of higher elements, the ones that are higher than iron on the periodic table. Very simplified summary is the real light ones are from the Big Bang, pretty much just hydrogen and helium. From boron up to iron, you create them through fusion in stars, and above iron, only through a supernova explosion. A lot of these ones from boron to iron don't really form much from fusion in stars. It's kind of scattered. It would take too long to go into. So the upshot. The upshot of this is that our sun is a second or third generation star. How do we know that? Because we're sitting here in this room. We're sitting here in this room with iron in our blood, made up of carbon, in a room with plaster, carbon, sulfur, oxygen, breathing oxygen in the air. All those elements wouldn't be out here in the planets. They'd still be stuck in the star if the star was making them, or maybe not even there if it was younger in a star's life. That means we had to have a supernova explosion to blast those things out of the star. And I've got a little bit of silver on, and some of us have platinum or gold or other higher elements like that can only be formed in a supernova. Looking at the proportions of these, astronomers are estimating we're probably third generation. Without the deaths of those earlier stars, we wouldn't be here. We couldn't even have an Earth itself, and certainly couldn't have the elements we need for life. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, all of those. Okay, those are the bare facts. To those bare facts, we can attach meaning and inspiration if we want. I happen to do so in at least 4 ways. Let me cover these 4 ways that some people attach significance to these, including myself. In fact, I find these 4 ways to be so powerful, so undeniable, that I think you'd have to be made out of wood not to be inspired by them. When Carl Sagan was a young boy, he asked what stars were. The adults didn't know. He ended up at the library looking it up. And what he found out was that they were these huge, luminous balls of hydrogen a long ways away. They were so far away that they looked small. And he thought, now hold on a second. I can see that street lamp. And I can walk down the road and still see that street lamp. It looks a little dimmer. If they're that big, they must be an awfully long ways away. Now, he didn't know exactly how you do the math and how those things work at long distances. But he realized that they had to be farther away than 52nd Street. In fact, he thought they'd probably be farther away than New Jersey. And he began to see the huge scales of distance in our universe. That connection, that ability to grasp that huge scale of distance is one of the gifts the stars give me. That I can think how far away they must be, how grand and enormous our universe has to be for the stars to look small. I couldn't even really put a picture up here. If I put a picture of a starry sky, it doesn't really convey it, I don't think, because it looks too much like little lights up in the sky. I put the picture from the Apollo mission showing the Earth from the moon. And to think, we know that this has to be an incredible distance because we're familiar with some of the distances here on the Earth. For the Earth to look that small, it must be a far, far distance. And the stars are many, many millions of times this distance. Wow. That's one. Another one is going back to some of our ancient legends and understandings. The Zulu in Africa believed the stars were the eyes of our deceased ancestors looking down at us with love, with guidance. If we look at our ancestry, we can look at our parents, grandparents, we can look back several generations, hundreds of years, and we've got thousands of ancestors if we do that. And then we go back before that. We look through early humans. We look through early mammals. We look through early life. We look through the start of life on Earth. And it started with DNA, RNA molecule, hooking together elements, chemical elements in the ocean, perhaps, maybe other places on Earth. And we realized that those chemical elements, the carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, there's no way you get those except stars. Stars have to put those together. That means if I said, who are the parents of that DNA molecule? Who are the parents of those first elements? Stars. That means that the stars are very much like the stars that were our ancestors. Our ancestors in a very literal way. To think that I'm descended from stars. Wow. Wow. In the same way that the Zulu looked at these and saw their ancestors, we can look up at the night sky and think that's what our ancestors were like. Another way, those same elements obviously are what make us up today. That means we're literally made out of stars. Can you imagine looking at your arm with this realization? Saying, oh my gosh, this piece of carbon, this piece of oxygen in here, this is from the stars, a gift from the stardust. This pencil, this table, stardust. Everything around us is stardust. What a luminous and uplifting way to see the world, to see your loved ones, to see yourself, to see your children. That we are, in a very real sense, walking, breathing, loving stars. Wow. And a fourth way, one that I would encourage you not to forget. And that's that if we look at these stories, a lot of them contain meaning, purpose, and connections that connect us to our ancestors, our millions of ancestors that lived back then and made these stories. I look at them and I find things that are meaningful, helpful, healthy, and useful, and I think there's another connection, another way to see our connection to the stars, our connection to these people who lived so long ago. Whether they're directly our ancestors or not, if they might be more recent, but ancient people like us nonetheless, like this one. The idea of a mother and a father working together to make the household work. And that opens up to us the entire list of star legends for meaning and purpose. Now we might look at them and find some things that aren't so healthy. Maybe the idea of, in the story with Andromeda, of a jealous god that's going to wreak havoc if you say something as bold as the suggestion that you might be on an equal plane with them. That sounds a little petty. Maybe we don't need to draw meaning from that particular aspect, but from other ones, we might find things that are meaningful, are healthy, and are wonderful. And there's a lot to choose from. Those are the 4 ways for me. All right, we're back to awareness. The awareness of the stars. The stars that ruled the lives of our ancestors. And for many of us today, they don't. Because you walk outside and you can see a few stars. And you don't usually walk outside because you've got a fully lighted, fully heated house to live in. Unless you're in darker areas, you might not see the night sky in its full glory very often. I've only seen it, a number of times, maybe once or twice a year, depending on what's going on. I would encourage you to get a chance to see that night sky. And when you do, to remember, to think that this was what life was like again and again for so many of our ancestors, for all of them once you go back a certain distance. However, there is at least one way that our modern awareness of stars is good. And that's in the sense that we know more about the stars, and when we see them, we can see the whole battles going on between gravity and fusion. We can see the synthesis of the air that will eventually come from that star, or the carbon that might give rise to life. We can see so much more behind the stars than just a little light. We can see things like black holes, X-ray gamma bursts, and things like that, with knowing them by looking up at the stars or by looking up the information and learning about it. That can be truly inspiring, and that's one way that our stellar awareness can be really good this time too. If we combine that, at least try to get out at least, sometimes now and then to look at them. So, we saw how our ancient ancestors saw them. For us, with just a little effort, the stars can be present. Again, much more than present. The stars can be important. They can be important because they're making these atoms that we see the same atoms here on Earth. They can be a reminder that how we use these atoms on Earth is going to have a huge effect on future generations, on our kids and grandkids. What are we doing with the carbon and oxygen that make carbon dioxide? What are we doing with the phosphorus that helps crops grow? That's one way we can help these stars be important and meaningful. I hope that I was able to convey some little bit of those 4 ways they're meaningful to me, and that I think they can be meaningful to others. So with that, thank you, and blessed be.
Amen.
Any quick questions before we go to business?
I thought a star got bigger as it got older.
It does. That's correct. When a star reaches the end of its life and it starts to go to those higher levels of fusion, depending on the size of the star, it will often create enough energy to do a little bit better in pushing back against gravity, and it'll expand to a very huge size. That's where you get some of these gas giants that we saw on here, like Antares, which is the red star that you see in Scorpio. If you look in Scorpio, that's the red star. And an example there is if you look at our sun, it's exactly what our star is going to do. When it gets towards the end of its life in about 3 to 4 billion years, it's going to expand, and it's going to expand so much that it's going to engulf Mercury, engulf Venus, and probably the Earth. We're going to be right about the surface of the star. So yeah, it does. And it's a little bit complicated because as it goes through at different stages, it might get a little smaller and then bigger at the end, and it's not a straight progression. But yeah, towards the end, exactly right. Yep. All right.
Okay, thank you.
On to Samhain.